The year is 323 BCE. In a palace chamber in Babylon, the greatest conqueror the world has ever known lies dying. Alexander III of Macedon. Alexander the Great has carved an empire stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the edges of India. Millions bow to his name, cities bear his mark, his armies have never known defeat. But empires built on the will of one man are fragile things. Alexander's fever burns. His generals gather around his bedside, their faces masks of concern, their hearts already calculating. "To whom do you leave the empire?" they ask. Some say he whispered, "To the strongest." Others claim he said nothing at all, his signet ring slipping from weakening fingers to the floor, a symbol of power waiting to be claimed. Within days he is dead. He is 32 years old. What follows is not mourning but chaos. The empire doesn't fracture, it explodes. His generals, the Diadochi, turn on each other like wolves. Ptolemy seizes Egypt. Seleucus claims the eastern territories. Antigonus carves out Asia Minor. Cassander takes Macedonia itself. They call themselves successors, but they are warlords, each one convinced they alone can inherit Alexander's divine mandate. For 40 years, the wars of the Diadochi will rage, cities will burn, bloodlines will end. The Mediterranean world will become a battlefield where former brothers in arms slaughter each other's sons. But in 281 BCE, on a plain in Anatolia, one battle will end it all. This is not a story you were taught in school. History remembers Alexander's conquests, his brilliance, his legend. But history often forgets the moment when that legend died, not with the man, but with his dream. This is the story of Corupedium, the battle that erased Alexander's empire and proved that even the mightiest legacy can be undone in a single day. To understand how an empire fell, we must first understand what held it together. Alexander's conquests were not merely military, they were ideological. He didn't just conquer lands, he fused worlds. Greek culture merged with Persian tradition, cities rose where camps once stood. He married a Persian princess, encouraged his generals to do the same, and envisioned a unified world where East and West became one. It was ambitious, it was radical, and it required Alexander himself to maintain. Without him, the empire was a body without a spine. His generals were brilliant tacticians, seasoned warriors who had stood beside him through impossible campaigns. But they were not Alexander. They lacked his vision, his charisma, the almost supernatural aura that made men believe he was descended from gods. More critically, they lacked his legitimacy. Alexander had inherited the Macedonian throne, conquered Persia, claimed Egypt as pharaoh. He was king, conqueror, and divine figure rolled into one. His generals? They were soldiers. Talented, yes. Ruthless, certainly. But soldiers nonetheless. When Alexander died, he left behind a half-Persian son, Alexander IV, just 6 years old, and a mentally disabled half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus. Neither could rule. Both became pawns in a deadly game of succession. The Diadochi initially tried cooperation. They divided the empire into satrapies, swearing oaths of loyalty to the royal bloodline. It was a fiction no one believed. Within a year, Perdiccas, the regent, was assassinated by his own officers. Within a decade, both of Alexander's heirs were murdered. The empire was a prize, and only blood would determine who claimed it. By 301 BCE, 22 years after Alexander's death, the major players had consolidated their power. Ptolemy ruled Egypt with an iron grip. Seleucus controlled the vast eastern territories, Persia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Lysimachus held Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Cassander ruled Macedonia, though his health was failing. But one figure remained a titan from the old guard, a man who refused to accept that Alexander's empire was dead. His name was Antigonus Monophthalmus. Antigonus, the one-eyed. Antigonus was 80 years old when he died at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. He died fighting, leading his army from the front, refusing to surrender even as enemy pikes closed around him. He died believing he could reunify Alexander's empire under his own banner. He failed. But his son did not give up the dream. Demetrius Poliorcetes. Demetrius the Besieger was everything his father had been and more. Tall, handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. Where Antigonus had been a blunt instrument, Demetrius was a scalpel. He understood propaganda, spectacle, and the power of personality. He fashioned himself as Alexander reborn, draping himself in royal purple, commissioning statues and poems celebrating his godlike qualities. After Ipsus, Demetrius's empire was shattered, his father was dead, his territories were lost, but he still commanded a fleet, still held cities, and still inspired loyalty. For 2 decades, he clawed his way back, seizing Macedonia itself in 294 BCE and proclaiming himself king. But the other Diadochi would not allow it. Seleucus and Ptolemy had grown old, watching men like Antigonus try to resurrect Alexander's empire. They would not watch Demetrius do the same. In 285 BCE, Demetrius launched a bold campaign into Asia Minor, hoping to reclaim the eastern territories his father once held. It was a disaster. His army deserted him, his allies betrayed him. He was captured by Seleucus and held prisoner for 3 years before drinking himself to death in captivity. But Demetrius had a son, and that son would be the final obstacle in the Diadochi's endless war. Lysimachus was 74 years old in 281 BCE. He was one of the last survivors of Alexander's inner circle, a man who had fought beside the conqueror in India, who had survived wounds, betrayals, and decades of war. He ruled Thrace and much of Asia Minor, a kingdom forged through cunning and brutality. But age had made him paranoid. In 282 BCE, he executed his own son, Agathocles, convinced the young man was plotting against him. It was a catastrophic mistake. Agathocles had been beloved, a competent leader and a stabilizing force. His execution turned Lysimachus's court against him. Officers fled, cities rebelled, allies reconsidered their loyalty. One of those who fled was Philetaerus, the governor of Pergamon. He took the royal treasury with him, 9,000 talents of gold and silver, and offered it to Seleucus. Seleucus Nicator. Seleucus the victor. If Lysimachus was the last shadow of Alexander's original generals, Seleucus was the last titan. At 77 years old, he ruled the largest of the successor kingdoms, an empire stretching from Syria to the borders of India. He had spent decades consolidating power, crushing rebellions, and building a dynasty that would last for centuries. But he was not content. Lysimachus's weakness was an opportunity. If Seleucus could defeat him, he would control nearly all of Alexander's former empire, everything except Egypt, where Ptolemy's son now ruled. It would be the final unification, the final attempt to resurrect what Alexander had built. Seleucus gathered his army and marched west. The stage was set. 2 of the last surviving Diadochi, both in their 70s, both commanded armies of veterans who had spent their entire lives at war. One battle would decide everything. They met at Corupedium, a plain in Lydia, in what is now western Turkey. The name means the field of Corus, though history would remember it differently. Some would call it the graveyard of empires. Others, the end of Alexander's dream. Both armies were massive. Estimates suggest Lysimachus commanded around 80,000 troops, Seleucus perhaps 75,000, but numbers alone did not tell the story. These were not fresh recruits or conscripts. These were soldiers who had fought in the wars of the Diadochi for decades. They knew the cost of defeat. They knew that empires rose and fell on days like this. Lysimachus deployed his forces in a traditional Macedonian formation, phalanxes of pike-wielding infantry at the center, cavalry on the flanks, light troops screening the front. It was the same formation Alexander had used to conquer the world. Seleucus mirrored the deployment. Both commanders were too experienced to experiment. This would not be a battle of clever tactics or daring maneuvers. This would be a test of will two armies grinding against each other until one broke. The dawn came cold and grey. The armies faced each other across the plain, thousands of men in bronze and iron, their breath misting in the morning air. Banners snapped in the wind. Lysimachus's personal standard, a lion's head. Seleucus's anchor, the symbol of stability and divine favor. For a moment, there was silence. Then the horns sounded. War is not glorious. It is not the clean, heroic clashes depicted in marble reliefs or romantic poetry. It is chaos, a cacophony of screaming men, splintering wood, the wet thud of bronze punching through flesh. It is dust and blood and the smell of ruptured intestines. It is human beings reduced to meat. Corupedium was all of this and more. The battle opened with a cavalry charge on the flanks. Lysimachus's horsemen thundered forward, their lances lowered, aiming to envelop Seleucus's lines. Seleucus responded in kind, his own cavalry surging to meet them. The collision was thunderous, horses screamed, men were hurled from their saddles, the ground shook with the impact. At the center, the phalanxes advanced. These were the backbone of Macedonian warfare, tightly packed formations of soldiers wielding sarissas, 18-foot pikes that created an impenetrable wall of iron points. The phalanx was not about individual skill, it was about discipline, cohesion, the ability to move as one organism. As the two phalanxes closed, the sarissas lowered. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful, two forests of spears tilting forward, catching the light. Then they met, and beauty became horror. The front ranks disintegrated, men were impaled, their bodies held upright by the press of soldiers behind them. Pikes snapped, shields shattered. The second rank stepped over the dying, pushing forward, adding their weight to the collision. The third rank did the same, and the fourth, and the fifth. This was the nightmare of phalanx warfare. The men at the front had no choice but to fight. They couldn't retreat, the ranks behind them pushed them forward. They couldn't dodge, the men beside them locked shields. They could only thrust their pikes, hoping to kill the enemy before the enemy killed them. The battle became a shoving match, tens of thousands of men pressing against each other, the front lines grinding together like millstones. Soldiers suffocated in the crush. Others were trampled by their own comrades. The ground became slick with blood, making footing treacherous. Lysimachus rode behind his lines, shouting orders, rallying his troops. At 74, he was still imposing, a tall, scarred veteran with a voice that could cut through the din of battle. He had fought in some of the bloodiest campaigns in history. He had survived assassination attempts, political purges, and the endless betrayals of the Diadochi wars. He was not going to lose here. But war has no respect for reputation. On the right flank, Seleucus's cavalry broke through. Lysimachus's horsemen, outnumbered and outflanked, began to falter. Panic is contagious on a battlefield. Once one unit breaks, others follow. Seleucus's cavalry wheeled around, crashing into the exposed flank of Lysimachus's phalanx. A phalanx is invincible from the front. From the side, it is helpless. The sarissas, designed to face forward, couldn't turn quickly. The soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder, couldn't maneuver. Seleucus's cavalry rode them down, spears punching through unarmored sides, horses trampling men into the mud. Lysimachus saw the disaster unfolding. He spurred his horse forward, trying to rally his men, to stabilize the line. It was the act of a brave commander and a fatal mistake. What happened next is debated by historians. Some say Lysimachus was struck by a javelin. Others claim he was surrounded and cut down in close combat. A few sources suggest he was deliberately targeted by one of Seleucus's officers, a man who recognized the aging king and saw an opportunity for glory. What is certain is that Lysimachus died on that field. His body was found later, trampled and looted, barely recognizable. The king who had fought beside Alexander, who had ruled Thrace for nearly 40 years, who had survived every betrayal and battle the Diadochi wars could throw at him, he died in the mud, another corpse, in a field of corpses. With their king dead, Lysimachus's army collapsed. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. Some tried to surrender. Seleucus's troops cut them down anyway. Others fought to the death, forming desperate shield walls that were methodically annihilated. The rout turned into a massacre. By nightfall, the Battle of Corupedium was over. Estimates of the dead vary wildly. Ancient sources are notoriously unreliable, but tens of thousands died that day. The plain was carpeted with bodies, the air thick with the smell of death. Seleucus had won. He stood victorious on the field, master of nearly all of Alexander's empire. He had 3 months to enjoy his triumph. Victory in ancient warfare was rarely clean. After Corupedium, Seleucus's army swept through Lysimachus's territories, occupying cities, seizing treasuries, and accepting the surrender of garrisons. Resistance was minimal. Lysimachus's death had broken his kingdom's spine. His officers had no one to rally around, no legitimate heir to proclaim. Within weeks, Seleucus controlled all of Asia Minor and Thrace. He was the undisputed master of the East. Only Ptolemaic Egypt remained independent, and Ptolemy's kingdom was secure behind its deserts and delta fortifications. For the first time since Alexander's death, the dream of reunification seemed possible. Seleucus was 77 years old. He had spent 56 years at war. He had outlived Alexander, outlived most of the Diadochi, outlived his own sons and rivals. He had built an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. He had earned his epithet Nicator, the victor. But he had one final ambition: Macedonia. Macedonia was not just a kingdom, it was the homeland, the beating heart of the Hellenistic world. It was where Alexander had been born, where the companion cavalry had trained, where the legend began. To rule Macedonia was to claim Alexander's true legacy. After Lysimachus's death, Macedonia had fallen into chaos. The kingdom had no clear ruler. Various factions vied for control. It was vulnerable, ripe for the taking. Seleucus marched west with a small force, intending to cross the Hellespont and claim the Macedonian throne. He was accompanied by a retinue of officers and advisors, including a young man named Ptolemy Ceraunus. Ptolemy Ceraunus. Ptolemy the Thunderbolt was the exiled son of Ptolemy I of Egypt. He had been passed over for the Egyptian throne in favor of his younger half-brother and had spent years wandering the courts of the Diadochi, seeking allies and nursing his bitterness. He had joined Lysimachus's court, but after the king's paranoia and cruelty became unbearable, he fled to Seleucus. Seleucus had welcomed him, perhaps out of pity, perhaps because Ceraunus was useful, a potential puppet ruler for Egypt if Seleucus ever decided to invade. Or perhaps because Seleucus, in his old age, had grown careless. In September of 281 BCE, Seleucus and his retinue landed on the European shore of the Hellespont near the ancient city of Lysimachia. Seleucus was in high spirits. Victory was within reach. Macedonia would be his. The empire would be whole. He dismounted his horse to perform a sacrifice to the gods, a ritual offering to ensure success in his final campaign. As he knelt before the altar, Ptolemy Ceraunus approached from behind. Some say Seleucus never saw the blade. Others claim he turned at the last moment, recognizing the betrayal in Ceraunus's eyes. It didn't matter. The dagger plunged into his ribs, punching through muscle and organ. Seleucus gasped, staggered, and fell. The great victor, the last of Alexander's generals, died in seconds, not in battle, not at the head of his army, but on his knees, murdered by a man he had sheltered, a man he had trusted. Ptolemy Ceraunus moved fast. Before Seleucus's bodyguards could react, he proclaimed himself king of Macedonia. He had Seleucus's blood on his hands and ambition in his heart. He rallied the troops, claiming that Seleucus had grown too old, too weak, that the empire needed young, vigorous leadership. Some soldiers believed him. Others were simply pragmatic. Chaereaunus controlled the moment, and soldiers followed power. Within hours, he had consolidated control. Within days, he had occupied Macedonia. Seleucus's death shattered the dream of reunification. His empire did not pass intact to his heirs. Instead, it fragmented. His son, Antiochus I, inherited the eastern territories, founding what would become the Seleucid Empire. But Asia Minor, Thrace, and Macedonia splintered into competing kingdoms. The unity Seleucus had fought for, the empire he had bled to build, dissolved like smoke. Ptolemy Chaereaunus's reign was short and brutal. Within 2 years he would be dead, killed in battle against invading Celtic tribes. His head, severed from his body, would be mounted on a spear and paraded before the Gallic warriors as a trophy. But the damage was done. Corupedium had killed Lysimachus. The assassination of Seleucus killed the dream of Alexander's empire. Empires do not die in a single moment. They decay, fragment, and collapse over years, even decades, but they can be broken in a single day. Corupedium and the murder of Seleucus broke the last hope of reuniting Alexander's conquests. The wars of the Diadochi officially ended, not because the fighting stopped, but because there was nothing left to fight for. The dream was dead. In the decades that followed, 3 major Hellenistic kingdoms emerged from the wreckage. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy's descendants. The Seleucid Empire in the east, stretching from Syria to Persia. And the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, eventually stabilized under the descendants of Antigonus Gonatas, Demetrius's son. These kingdoms would endure for centuries, but they were not Alexander's empire. They were successor states, heirs to a broken legacy. They fought each other, formed alliances, and carved out spheres of influence, but none could reunify the whole. And in the shadows, a new power was rising, one that would eventually consume them all. Rome. In 281 BCE, Rome was a regional power in Italy, struggling to control the peninsula. The Romans had heard of Alexander, of course. His legend had reached even their distant shores. But they had never fought the Hellenistic kingdoms. They had never tested their legions against the Macedonian phalanx. That would come later. In 197 BCE, at the Battle of Cynocephalae, Roman legions would shatter a Macedonian phalanx for the first time, proving that the military system Alexander had perfected was obsolete. In 168 BCE, at the Battle of Pydna, Rome would conquer Macedonia itself, ending the Antigonid dynasty. The Seleucid Empire would fall piece by piece, nibbled away by Rome, Parthia, and internal rebellions. By 63 BCE, it would be reduced to a rump state, finally annexed by Rome. The Ptolemaic kingdom, the richest and most stable of the successor states, would be the last to fall. In 30 BCE, after the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, would commit suicide, and Egypt would become a Roman province. Alexander's empire, which had taken 13 years to conquer, took 2.5 centuries to fully die, but its death began at Corupedium. Why did it fail? Why couldn't the Diadochi reunify what Alexander had built? The answer is both simple and complex. Alexander's empire was built on his personal authority. He was king, general, and god figure. His charisma held together Greeks and Persians, Macedonians and Egyptians. He could demand loyalty not just through force, but through belief. Belief that he was destined to rule, that he was something more than human. The Diadochi were brilliant generals, but they were not Alexander. They lacked his legitimacy, his vision, his almost supernatural ability to inspire. They were warlords competing for scraps, each one convinced they could recreate the magic, none of them understanding that the magic was Alexander himself. Moreover, the empire was too vast, too diverse. Alexander had conquered it quickly, 13 years from Greece to India, but he had not had time to consolidate. The administrative structures were fragile. The cultural fusion he envisioned was incomplete. When he died, there was no institutional framework to hold it together, only the force of his will. The Diadochi Wars exposed this weakness. For 40 years, the empire was a battlefield. Cities changed hands dozens of times, populations were displaced, economies collapsed. The dream of a unified Hellenistic world became a nightmare of endless war. Corupedium was the final proof that the dream was unsustainable. Two of the last surviving Diadochi, both elderly, both exhausted, fought one last time to claim Alexander's inheritance. One died on the field. The other was murdered 3 months later, and with their deaths, the possibility of reunification died as well. But Corupedium's significance goes beyond the immediate collapse of the empire. It marked a turning point in history, the moment when the Hellenistic age truly began. Alexander's conquests had spread Greek culture across the known world. His cities, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Seleucia in Mesopotamia, became centers of learning, trade, and cultural exchange. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Philosophy, science, and art flourished. But this Hellenistic culture was not imposed from above by a single emperor. It evolved organically in the successor kingdoms, blending Greek traditions with local customs. The Ptolemies adopted Egyptian religious practices. The Seleucids incorporated Persian administrative systems. Greek settlers married local women, creating hybrid cultures that were neither purely Greek nor purely Eastern. This was not Alexander's vision. His dream had been more centralized, more unified. But in its own way, the Hellenistic world that emerged from the ruins of his empire was richer and more diverse. Corupedium allowed this to happen. By ending the dream of reunification, it freed the successor kingdoms to develop independently, to experiment, to adapt. The collapse of the empire was also a liberation. History is written by the survivors, and in the case of the Diadochi, the survivors were liars. The official histories of the successor kingdoms painted their founders as heroes, wise rulers who brought order from chaos, who honored Alexander's memory while building their own legacies. Ptolemaic propaganda presented Ptolemy I as Alexander's closest friend, the loyal companion who had saved the empire from collapse. Seleucid sources portrayed Seleucus as a just and pious king chosen by the gods to rule. The reality was far uglier. These were men who had murdered their way to power. Ptolemy had hijacked Alexander's funeral procession, stealing the conqueror's corpse to legitimize his rule over Egypt. Seleucus had betrayed and abandoned allies when convenient. Lysimachus had executed his own son. Antigonus had waged wars of extermination against rival claimants, and all of them had participated in the systematic erasure of Alexander's family. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, he left behind a wife, Roxana, pregnant with his son. He also had a half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, who was mentally disabled but of royal blood. Both were proclaimed co-kings, with the Diadochi serving as regents. Neither lived long. Philip III was murdered in 317 BCE, stabbed to death on the orders of Olympias, Alexander's mother. Olympias herself was executed a year later, stoned to death by soldiers loyal to Cassander. Alexander's son, Alexander IV, was kept under house arrest by Cassander and quietly murdered around 310 BCE when he was 13 years old. His mother, Roxana, was killed alongside him. Cassander also murdered Alexander's widow, Statira, and his illegitimate son, Heracles, eliminating every direct heir. By 310 BCE, Alexander's bloodline was extinct. This was not accidental, it was policy. As long as a legitimate heir existed, the Diadochi's power was illegitimate. They were regents, not kings. Murdering the royal family allowed them to claim the throne without pretense. But it also destroyed any hope of unity. Alexander's family, however weak, had been a symbol, a focal point around which the empire could rally. Without them, there was no center, no common cause. The empire became a prize to be divided, not a legacy to be preserved. Corupedium was the logical endpoint of this process. Lysimachus and Seleucus were the last of Alexander's original generals. They had been with him in Persia, in India, at the edge of the known world. They had seen the empire at its height, and they had spent decades tearing it apart. When they met at Corupedium, they were not fighting to preserve Alexander's legacy. They were fighting for personal power, for the right to call themselves king. The empire was already dead. The battle was just a funeral. But there is another layer to this tragedy. The Diadochi Wars did not just destroy Alexander's empire, they destroyed the possibility of the empire itself. Before Alexander, empires were regional. The Persians controlled the Near East, the Greeks dominated the Aegean, the Egyptians ruled the Nile. These were separate worlds, occasionally colliding but never truly merging. Alexander shattered that separation. He conquered Persia, absorbed Egypt, and pushed into India. He created a world-spanning empire that, for the first time in history, connected East and West under a single ruler. It was unprecedented, and it terrified people. The Persian Empire had been vast, but it was also distant. A Greek farmer in Athens knew that the Persian king existed, but he never saw him, never felt his direct authority. The empire was an abstraction. Alexander's empire was different. It was immediate, personal, overwhelming. He moved armies across continents. He founded cities overnight. He married Greek soldiers to Persian women, creating a new hybrid population. He demanded worship as a god. It was too much, too fast. When he died, the relief was palpable. The Diadochi Wars were not just a power struggle, they were a reversion to the mean, a return to the regional kingdoms that people understood. Corupedium confirmed this reversion. The dream of a unified world empire died on that battlefield. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged were large, yes, but they were not universal. They were bounded, comprehensible, manageable. It would be centuries before anyone tried to build a world empire again. And when they did, when Rome extended its legions across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, they learned from Alexander's mistakes. The Romans did not demand worship, they did not try to fuse cultures, they allowed local autonomy, regional diversity. They built an empire that could survive the death of any one man. In this sense, Corupedium taught the world a lesson. Empires cannot be held together by the will of one individual, no matter how brilliant. They require institutions, laws, structures that outlast any single ruler. Alexander never understood this. The Diadochi never understood this. They believed in the power of the strong man, the heroic general, the divinely chosen king. And so they tore the empire apart, each one convinced they could be the next Alexander. None of them succeeded, and in their failure, they changed history. Here is the bitter irony of Corupedium. It is one of the most important battles in ancient history, and almost no one has heard of it. Ask a random person to name a famous ancient battle, and they will say Marathon, or Thermopylae, or Gaugamela Alexander's crushing victory over Darius III. They will remember the battles that built empires, the heroic stands, the moments when history turned on a spear's edge. But Corupedium, the battle that ended Alexander's empire? Silence. There are no movies about Corupedium, no epic poems, no paintings by Renaissance masters depicting Lysimachus's last stand. Even historians gloss over it, treating it as a footnote in the larger narrative of the Diadochi Wars. Why? Why is this battle forgotten? Part of the answer is practical. Ancient sources on Corupedium are sparse. We have brief mentions in histories written centuries later, Appian's Syrian Wars, Justin's epitome of Pompeius Trogus, scattered references in Plutarch and Pausanias. But there is no detailed account, no Arrian or Thucydides to immortalize the battle with vivid, blow-by-blow descriptions. We do not know the exact size of the armies. We do not know the precise tactics. We do not even know with certainty where Corupedium was located. Historians place it somewhere in Lydia, near modern-day Turkey, but the exact site has never been found. This lack of detail has made Corupedium difficult to dramatize, difficult to teach, difficult to remember. It exists in the historical record as a name and a date, but not as a story. But there is a deeper reason for its obscurity, one that reveals something profound about how we remember history. Corupedium was a battle of endings, not beginnings. It did not create a hero, it did not found a dynasty, it did not inspire a legend. It was the moment when the dream died, when the last titans of the Hellenistic world killed each other in a final, futile spasm of violence. And we do not like stories about endings. We like stories about triumphs, about brave warriors overcoming impossible odds, about empires rising from nothing. We want our history to be inspirational, not tragic. Corupedium is a tragedy. It is the story of old men who could not let go, who fought one last battle for a dream that was already dead. There is no glory here, only waste. Lysimachus died in the mud, betrayed by his own paranoia and the cruelty he inflicted on his son. Seleucus was murdered by a man he had sheltered, a victim of his own misplaced trust. Ptolemy Keraunus seized power through assassination and was dead within 2 years, his head severed and displayed as a trophy. These are not heroes. They are cautionary tales. And yet, Corupedium matters. It matters because it reveals the fragility of power, the futility of trying to hold together an empire through force of will alone. It matters because it shows us that even the greatest legacies, even Alexander's, can be undone. History is not a story of inevitable progress. It is not a steady march toward greater unity, greater enlightenment, greater justice. It is a cycle of creation and destruction, of empires rising and falling, of dreams built and dreams shattered. Corupedium is the shattering, and we forget it at our peril. Because the lesson of Corupedium is not just about ancient history, it is about the nature of power itself. Every empire believes it is eternal. The Persians believed it. Alexander believed it. The Romans would believe it. The Mongols, the Ottomans, the British. Every great power in history has looked at its dominion and thought, this will last forever. None of them do. None of them can. Empires are built by individuals, conquerors, visionaries, ruthless strategists, but they cannot be sustained by individuals. They require institutions, shared purpose, legitimacy beyond personal charisma. Without these, they are fragile, vulnerable to the ambitions of the next strongman, the next general, the next Ptolemy Keraunus with a dagger and a dream. Alexander's empire fell because it was Alexander's. It was built on his genius, his vision, his almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty. When he died, there was nothing left but the ambition of smaller men. Corupedium proved this. 2 of the greatest generals of their age, both veterans of Alexander's campaigns, both rulers of vast territories, and they could not put the empire back together. They tried, they fought, and they failed. The lesson is clear. No one man can hold the world, and any empire built on the idea that one man can is doomed to collapse. This is why we should remember Corupedium, not because it was glorious, but because it was honest. It stripped away the mythology of Alexander, the heroic narratives of conquest and destiny, and revealed the ugly truth underneath. Empires are temporary, power is fleeting, and even the greatest legacies turn to dust. In 30 BCE, nearly 250 years after Corupedium, the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms fell. Cleopatra VII, the final Ptolemaic ruler, committed suicide after her defeat at the Battle of Actium. Egypt, the richest and most culturally vibrant of the successor states, became a Roman province. It was the end of an era. The Hellenistic age, which had begun with Alexander's conquests and fragmented with the Diadochi wars, was over. Rome had absorbed it all: Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt. The dream of a unified Hellenistic empire, which had died at Corupedium, was replaced by a new dream, Pax Romana. But the legacy of Alexander and the Diadochi did not disappear. It was woven into the fabric of the Roman Empire, into the Byzantine Empire that followed, into the Islamic caliphates that conquered the Near East, into the Renaissance humanists who rediscovered Greek philosophy. The cities Alexander founded, Alexandria, Antioch, Seleucia, remained centers of learning and trade for centuries. The Greek language, spread by his conquests, became the language of the New Testament, of early Christian theology, of scientific discourse. The cultural fusion he envisioned, the blending of East and West, continued even after his empire fell. In this sense, Alexander won. Not militarily, his empire collapsed within a generation, but culturally, intellectually, his impact was profound. He changed the world, even if he could not control it. Corupedium was the moment when military unification failed, but cultural unification continued. The Hellenistic world, fractured politically, remained connected through language, philosophy, art, and trade. The successor kingdoms fought each other, yes, but they also influenced each other, learned from each other, built on each other's achievements. This is the paradox of the empire. It can be destroyed on a battlefield, erased by assassination, shattered by civil war. But the ideas it spreads, the cultures it mingles, the connections it creates, these endure. Corupedium killed Alexander's political empire, but it could not kill his cultural legacy. And perhaps that is the real lesson. Empires built on conquest are fragile. Empires built on culture, on shared ideas and mutual influence, are resilient. They do not require a single ruler, a single army, a single dynasty. They evolve, adapt, survive. The Hellenistic world survived Corupedium. It survived the fall of the Diadochi. It survived Roman conquest, barbarian invasions, and the rise of Islam. Elements of it persist today in our philosophy, our science, our art, our political ideas. But the dream of a military empire, of one man ruling the world, died on that plain in Anatolia in 281 BCE. Lysimachus and Seleucus were the last true believers. After them, no one seriously tried to reunify Alexander's conquests. The successor kingdoms accepted the division. Rome, when it came, conquered piece by piece, pragmatically, without the megalomaniacal vision of a new Alexander. Corupedium taught the world that unity cannot be imposed by force alone. It must be earned, nurtured, built on something more than the will of a single conqueror. This is why the battle matters. Not because it was dramatic, though it was, not because it involved famous generals, though it did, but because it marked the death of an idea, the idea that one man, through brilliance and force of will, can hold the world together. Alexander tried. Diadochi tried. They all failed, and in their failure, they reshaped history. We live in the shadow of that failure. Every modern nation-state, every international alliance, every attempt at global governance is haunted by the question, how do you create unity without tyranny? How do you build an empire or a world order that does not collapse the moment the strong man dies? Corupedium offers no answers, but it asks the right questions. And so, on a forgotten plain in ancient Lydia, where two old men fought one last battle for a dead dream, history turned. The age of Alexander ended, the age of the successor kingdoms began, and the world, fractured and fragmented, stumbled forward into an uncertain future. The empire was erased, but the echoes remain. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that when Alexander the Great died, his generals asked him, "To whom do you leave your empire?" And he replied, with his dying breath, "To the strongest." If he truly said this, it was the cruelest joke in history, because the strongest did not inherit the empire. They destroyed it. Lysimachus was strong, Seleucus was strong, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Cassander, all of them were strong. They were the greatest generals of their age, veterans of campaigns that had taken them from Greece to India and back. They commanded armies of tens of thousands, ruled kingdoms of millions. And yet, they could not hold it together. The empire Alexander built in 13 years took 40 years to tear apart. And when the last two titans met at Corupedium, when they clashed one final time for the right to call themselves Alexander's heir, they proved once and for all that strength was not enough. Empires are not built on strength. They are built on legitimacy, on shared purpose, on institutions that outlast any one man. Without these, even the greatest conquests crumble. Corupedium was the moment when this truth became undeniable. The battle that erased Alexander's empire was not a glorious clash of heroes. It was a tragedy, a bloody, futile, inevitable tragedy. But from tragedy comes wisdom. And the wisdom of Corupedium is this: no crown is heavy enough to hold the world, no man is strong enough to bear it alone. Alexander tried. He failed, and the world moved on.